Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kristin Andrews. She is York Research Chair in Animal Minds and Professor of Philosophy at York University, Toronto, where she also helps coordinate the Cognitive Science Program and the Toronto Area Animal Cognition Discussion Group. Dr. Andrews is on the board of directors of the Borneo Orangutan Society Canada. She is a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada and the author of several books on social minds, animal minds, and ethics. So, Dr. Andrews, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a real pleasure to everyone.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, great. I guess that the first thing I would like to say is that through all of the conversations that I've had with ethicists and people who do work on, for example, comparative psychology, it's a really tricky business to try to answer the question of if other animals apart from humans have minds, what is a mind? What are the features of other animals' minds? In your work, you talk a lot about that in terms of what is the best approach for us to describe behaviors and to explain them. You, for example, refer to the calibration method. So, I don't know if first you would like to comment something on what I just said and then get into the method or go directly at it. But please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So this question about what is a mind and who has minds is a very old question in philosophy, right? The problem of other minds looms for humans as well as other animals, and maybe AI someday as well. But what we do when it comes to other humans is we look at their behavior and we can't help but see it as being purposeful, flexible, as having emotions, having goals, presenting rational behavior patterns that we think suggest rational thought patterns. And when we then look at other animals in the same sorts of way we look at other humans, when we look at their natural behaviors, when we engage with them, when we make predictions about what they're going to do if they do have the beliefs that we think they have, or if they do have the emotions we think they have, and our predictions come out right, then we also kind of just perceive the mind in those other animals. So I don't think it's any more of a tricky question to ask whether an animal has a mind over whether some other human has a mind, because we don't have direct access to either of those. We have direct access to our experiences and our minds to a certain extent. A lot of it goes on without our noticing it. So then the question becomes, how do we figure out what someone is thinking? With humans, we have this neat trick that we're using right now, language. It helps a lot. It doesn't help 100%. We're not positive about what people are thinking just because they're saying certain things. Language is another kind of behavior, and it requires interpretation. And when it comes to other animals, we have to figure out what they're thinking as well, if we're interested in that question. And we have their behavior and their communicative signals to try to figure out what they're thinking. So this question of like whether someone has a mind and what they're thinking, I think is on a par for humans and other animals. It's not a special, hard, tricky mystery when it comes to the dogs and cats and chimpanzees. Where it becomes tricky is when we think about what are the exact capacities that other animals have. And one of the reasons why that's tricky is that we're using these terms to describe capacities for humans, and then trying to figure out whether those terms apply to the other species. And this is where the calibration method comes in. So if we want to ask a specific question like, does an animal have a belief? Then we have to know, well, what are we asking? That's the first question. What is a belief? And a belief is both a part of folk psychology. We use this word belief in our normal everyday conversation. Oh, I believe that the store is open until 3, and so you should be able to go and buy eggs. It's fine. And belief is also a technical term in philosophy of mind and a technical term in cognitive psychology generally. And as a technical term, it means a representation that can be put together with other representations in order to lead to some sort of rational thought process, problem solving, practical reason, behavior. But in folk psychology, it is how we interpret the behavior that we're seeing the animals and other humans engage in. So if we want to ask, do animals have beliefs? First, we have to know what we mean by this term belief. And the first place to start with, I think, is our folk psychological use. That's how we get the question off the ground. It's how we know what domain we're talking about. And then we can then engage in some sort of experimentation, some observation, do some science. So we've got folk psychology to start with. We do some science. The science might say, hey, there's some problems with the folk psychology. We need to change that definition a little bit. Let's change it a little bit and then test it again and go back and forth in order to both figure out whether, say, an animal has a belief and figure out what beliefs are at the same time. So it's the calibration method is just an instance of reflective equilibrium when it comes to doing cognitive psychology, basically.
Mm-hmm. So there are several distinct points there to try to tease apart now. The first question I would like to ask you about what you just said is, so in terms of folk psychology, isn't it a bit controversial, the suggestion that you just made that we should start with folk psychology and then do some science on it and then perhaps correct some of it if it's necessary? I'm just asking this because isn't it the case that when psychologists particularly talk about folk psychology that they are referring to the sort of intuitions many times innate that we have about how our own minds operate and also about some specific aspects of the world, like for example, okay, so maybe now I'm going to another area. I was thinking maybe about folk biology and folk physics, but anyway, sticking with the folk psychology, aren't we talking about the kinds of intuitions that people have about how their minds operate, about how the minds of other people also operate? And so, I mean, to use that in science as a starting point, at least to some people, philosophers, etc., it's a bit controversial, right?
Yeah, so I think it's important to draw a distinction between folk psychological concepts and folk psychological platitudes, right? So a folk psychological concept would be something like memory or emotion or empathy or hunger, right? These are all psychological concepts that didn't come to be from formal psychology. They existed before formal psychology was even a field. Folk psychology. Folk psychological platitudes, on the other hand, is what you were talking about, are maybe our intuitions that I'm perfectly rational, or I'm right about everything, or human behavior is, the pinnacle of intelligence and nothing unconscious is ever happening, or something like that. And the folk psychological platitudes, I agree, isn't usually going to be the most helpful place to start doing the science. But the folk psychological concepts we can't do without. The folk psychological concepts is what got scientific psychology off the ground. It allowed us to formulate questions. So we have to have folk psychology in our science when it comes to the concepts, but we don't have to have people's lay opinions about like mechanisms for action as part of the science. That's not going to be helpful, right? The folk psychological platitude is like a bad interpretation of behavior. Have you ever been to a zoo and just watched the humans watching the animals? If you go, it's hilarious because you go to like an ape cage and you watch the orangutans do things, and you listen to kids say, "Oh, look, that orangutan's really happy. They're playing and they're actually having sex." Or someone else says, oh, look, that orangutan's really sad and crying, and they're having sex. They're doing the exact same thing, and the people are just interpreting it radically differently. They have no basis for those interpretations, right? So that doesn't have any role to play in science, for sure. But these ideas of happiness and sadness and play, those are concepts that do have a place in science. But what they refer to can be refined through the practice of the science.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I mean, you were referring to kids going to the zoo and even adults going to the zoo, probably.
Yeah. Adults.
Yeah.
It's
Because
when you look at the adults correct their kids, because they're also wrong. It's a fun way to spend an afternoon. Go to the zoo and watch the humans.
Yeah. I mean, we have all of these wrongful intuitions about other animals' minds and our own minds, and sometimes we talk about, particularly intellectual people, look down on other people and say, oh, they are just childish or stupid, but in fact, adults, when it comes to their psychological intuitions, are not really that much better than kids most of the time when interpreting the behavior even of other people. So.
Yeah. I wish we were better at it. It would make for a better society.
Yeah, sure. And I guess that leads us into the question of anthropomorphism and also, on the other end, anthropectomy. Because, I mean, sometimes we have this sort of dualistic way of approaching the minds of other animals. On the one hand, sometimes we sort of project too much into their minds and over-interpret what they do and over-attribute certain intentions, for example, to other animals, or think that they have some specific verbal thoughts, even, for example, that their beliefs are expressed in terms of language. I mean, it's very easy for people to say that, particularly about their pets, for example. But on the other hand, we also have the other extreme approach where people simply say that, or they have an approach like, for example, Descartes had, of thinking of other animals as simply automata or something like that. I mean, simply mechanistic without any sort of mind or soul or whatever word you want to use. So, I mean, what are the sorts of problems that these two different extreme approaches might bring to the study of animal minds?
Yeah, they're both biased perspectives, right? So an anthropomorphist might think everybody is like me, and you can be, egoistic and think all humans around me are like me. You can be culturally biased and think all cultures are going to be like my culture, and you can be anthropomorphic and think all species are going to be like the human species, and that's going to lead to certain kinds of bias. On the other hand, if you say humans are special and no one else is like us, or say my culture is special or my gender is special and no one else is as good as me, you're going to be biased as well and miss things. The problem is we're humans and we're biased, and we do science, and science is full of bias. So if the idea is let's avoid these biases, we're never going to get anywhere. I think what's much more helpful than to try to have principles of comparative psychology like anti-anthropomorphism or Morgan's canon, what we need to do is recognize the sources of bias in the practice of science and encourage approaches to the science that have different sorts of bias. So I'm working on a book that should be out next year called How to Study Animal Minds for Cambridge Elements. So it's a very short little book. And I'm arguing in this book that we can see historically sources of bias in animal cognition that are cultural. So the early primatologists in Japan, such as Imanishi, was arguing that animals have culture, back in the 60s. And this is long before anyone in the West thought that animals might have anything like culture. We first saw the first paper on animal culture in, I think it was 1999, with Andy Whitten and the other collaborators on the chimpanzee culture paper. So this idea of culture was something that the Japanese mindset was allowing these primatologists to see much better than in the West, because the Japanese, I think, had different views about what animals are, maybe based on religion. Some people argue it's based on their religious views. You know, I don't know why. But we see a bias, I think, from cultural perspectives. But we can also see a bias from methodological perspectives. So again, looking at chimpanzees, you know, field researchers and lab researchers who have different sorts of bias in their approaches. And they often argue with each other about, no, the controlled experiments are what's really going to tell us whether or not chimpanzees cooperate. And the field researchers say, no, I go out in the field and I watch chimpanzees doing what chimpanzees do in their real groups that are normal, and they're cooperating. And then you see big fights between these two camps. And that's not really helpful either, right? So you've got, in a sense, you've got the romantic anthropomorphists in the field saying, oh, chimpanzees are cooperating, they have friendship, they engage in war, and that anthropectic killjoy lab researchers saying, well, we keep looking for cooperation, we keep looking for joint intentionality, and we don't find it in the lab, and so no, that we don't have any evidence that chimps have these things. I think we need to really integrate these two approaches. We need to integrate field and lab. We need to integrate different perspectives from different cultures, people with anthropectic and anthropomorphic biases, and bring people together, recognizing, yes, we're all biased. Okay, what can we do now with the kinds of information that we have generated from the perspectives that we have? Maybe we can then look for the things the other person saw using our methods, and move forward that way. So that's my hope, is that it's great. It's great that we recognize bias. Let's now use it to move the science forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so let me now ask you a very specific question about that is a big topic in philosophy of mind and in cognitive science in general. I mean, the topic about theory of mind, because, I mean, this is a very delicate one, because when we think about theory of mind, what we are usually talking about is how we think about our own minds and the minds of other people and the sort of features that we attribute to them. And for example, when we are interacting with other people, thinking about what the other person is thinking and trying to predict her behavior and things like that. So, I mean, in terms of theory of mind for other animals, is there good enough evidence out there that other animals, particularly, I guess, or some other primates, also have a theory of mind, at least to some extent? And is it in a lesser degree or not? Or is it really a different kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that theory of mind as a term is so muddied that it's not entirely helpful anymore to use the term. Or at least you need to specify exactly what you mean by it. Yeah. So if you mean by theory of mind the ability to pass a false belief task, which some people seem to use it to refer to, then we now have evidence that great apes pass false belief tasks, and hence they have a theory of mind. This is great research by Chris Crupenye, Kano, and colleagues. And it took 40 years for humans to figure out how to extract false belief tracking behavior in the great apes. So it's a great example of how hard it is to do this kind of lab research. Really, researchers have been trying for 40 years, and these guys figured it out. And I think they figured it out because they were thinking like chimpanzees. What's exciting for a chimpanzee? Violence. Violence is really exciting. I'll watch a movie when like people are beating each other up. That's exciting. Moving an object from a basket to a box is not very interesting for a chimpanzee. So yeah, chimpanzees are sensitive to others' false beliefs, and we know that from these current studies. But do chimpanzees have a concept of belief? If you mean by theory of mind that you have to have a concept of belief, then it isn't clear to me that we have enough evidence to conclude that chimpanzees have the concept of belief. Though again, I would say that it's not clear to me that we have evidence that the infants who also pass these false belief tasks have a concept of belief. I think in order to have a concept, you need to show a robust pattern of evidence of the concept, not just show one example of tracking it in a false belief sort of situation. And we don't have that kind of robust evidence for the infants or for the apes at this point. Now, if by theory of mind you simply mean that an individual understands others have mental lives, then I think that, again, we can say, yeah, we have great evidence that lots of animals understand that other animals have mental lives. This comes both from experimental evidence and from naturalistic observations. So what does it mean to have a mental life? It means you have perspectives, you see things. We've known for many years that chimpanzees know what others can and can't see. It means that others maybe have goals. We've known this about apes too for many years. They understand that others have goals. A lot of this research, most of this research is coming out of Mike Tomasello's lab at Leipzig, Max Planck. They did a ton of great work to help us understand what apes understand about other minds. What else is it to understand that another has a mind? It's to understand that they have emotions, that they have relationships with others, and that they have interests. And I think that a lot of the naturalistic work has also shown that there's evidence of emotion recognition, sensitivity to relationships. And this is not just with primates, but with a whole host of species of animals. I think that the recent work on rat helping behavior has given us a lot of reason to think that rats are also able to attribute in mental states to other rats, that they want to rescue, that they seek out and rescue other rats who are trapped. If they've had an experience of being trapped, they're quicker at rescuing the rats who are trapped, suggesting that they're doing something like experience projection. And rats were also recently trained to play hide and seek and take turns hiding and seeking. And what's particularly interesting, so they were trained to do both of these, so it wasn't like a spontaneous sort of thing, but kids are trained to play hide and seek too. But what's interesting is that the rats were spontaneously quieter when they were hiding than when they were seeking. So what these things suggest is that if we think of theory of mind in this very general term as understanding that others have minds of some sort with emotions or intentions or goals, then I think that theory of mind is going to be widespread through the animal kingdom. On the other hand, if you think of theory of mind as having the concept of belief, and in particular truth and falsity, then it might be something that is not very widespread at all. And it may be something that's human unique. I don't know. I don't think that we have enough evidence yet. We need to do more research of different sorts. For example, we need to stop thinking of belief as only facilitating prediction of behavior, but think of belief as also facilitating explanation seeking, right? When we're trying to understand what others are doing, especially when they do something really weird, we ask, well, what are they thinking, right? That's what humans do when we're attributing belief. Do other animals ever think, what is he thinking? When they see another animal act oddly? I don't know. We need to figure that out too.
Mm-hmm. So let me just ask you a general question, either when it comes to theory of mind or maybe other mental capacities. I mean, we as humans are very focused on consciousness and language. I mean, whenever we think about thinking, it always comes to our minds that the other person or the other animal, for it to have some sort of complex cognitive abilities, must represent something at a conscious level or even at in a verbal way, right? So, I mean, when we are studying these kinds of capacities in other animals, I mean, is it necessary for them to have some sort of a conscious component? And if so, does it make them more complex in any way or not?
Yeah, those are good questions. So one of the strategies in comparative psychology has been to ignore consciousness altogether. If you look at the textbooks on comparative psychology, they rarely mention consciousness, and when they do, the suggestion is that consciousness isn't really an appropriate part of normal science of animal cognition. And if you are going to study it, as in episodic memory, which is supposed to have this, when you talk about human episodic memory, you're talking about reliving a past event. Or, you know, and a common example is like close your eyes and count the number of windows in your house. And so you're doing this in a very conscious, aware way. Research in episodic memory in animals often says episodic-like memory, because the consciousness part is what's left to the side. So it's a good question whether this is really a good method of comparative psychology, if we really can study animal cognition, cognitive capacities, without studying animal consciousness. And Donald Griffin, in his books back in the 70s and 80s, when he was trying to reintroduce consciousness into the study of animal minds, this is in response to behaviorism about animals, he was trying to get cognition and consciousness going at the same time. And I think that kind of conflated cognition with consciousness in a way that was unhelpful at the time. And so then the consciousness fell to the side and cognition took off without consciousness. But I think it's tricky. I think it's really tricky to be able to say we're going to study cognition without also including some understanding of consciousness. And let me just give you like some kind of basic examples of why I think that. So if you're working with, say you're working with rats in a lab and you just want to understand whether they do some sort of spatial learning task. So you're handling them and putting them in a maze. If you don't think of them as conscious beings at all, if you're trained not to consider them as having conscious experience and just subjects who can do this spatial learning task, then as you're handling them, you might not. You might be treating them differently. You might not be sensitive to the way you handle them might affect the way they behave in the maze, because they're just like little robots. You just put them in and see what they do and they run around. Whereas when we do research with kids, with infants, we spend the first 15 minutes or so as a researcher playing with the kid. I mean, I did research with kids in my PhD, and I had to spend a month in lab school playing with the kids and getting to know the kids before I could ever take them out to test them. So we spend all this time developing relationships with kids to get the best results from them when we give them the task. And if we don't do something along the same lines when we're working with rats or snakes or whatever species we're working with, we might not be getting the best results that we can get from the animals. So in that, even that very simple way, I think it's important for us to at least start reintroducing talk of consciousness and also instruction to comparative psychology students about how to think about animal consciousness in a way that doesn't just, make the kind of anthropomorphic mistake of seeing the animals as little humans in like a rat costume or something. But try to think about the sort of sensations and emotions that they'd be having as well when they're running the tasks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's. I think we need to bring consciousness back into the conversation. And it's tricky, and I don't really know exactly how to do it, but I think that it's hard work that we need to start engaging with. Mm-hmm. The science of consciousness studies assumes that animals are conscious, right? So it's very different than comparative psychology. Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, when they wrote their kind of manifesto for the scientific study of consciousness, they said, we're going to presume primates are conscious, and we're going to do neuroscience on monkeys in order to figure out the nature of consciousness. We've got to assume that these animals are conscious, or else we're not studying consciousness when we're studying monkeys. And I think that there's also something right about that. There's a certain, we have to start with assumptions because, again, like the problem of other minds, I only know directly my own conscious experience, not yours, not my dog, not a monkey or a snake or a goldfish. But if we start presuming they're conscious and seeing the effects of that presumption on their behavior plays out, then we've validated the presumption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this topic of consciousness, it's really, it's really complicated. I've already talked with several philosophers of mind, several cognitive scientists about consciousness, and I mean, we are not even sure why consciousness evolved to start with, because, I mean, on the one hand, there's that thing now, particularly with people that do work on embodied cognition, where people are more and more aware of how animals, I mean, can use their simpler nervous systems to exhibit complex behavior and to create complex things, like, for example, even the eusocial insects, right? So, I mean,
it's not just the eusocial insects, it's plants, right? It's the bean plant that is capable of engaging in associative learning processes. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're finding some really interesting things about learning in non-animal species, which suggests that at least learning is something that's going to be very evolutionarily old. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem at all. So, and I mean, then there's different kinds of consciousness. Philosophers talk, for example, about phenomenal consciousness and excess consciousness. And then it gets even messier because then there's a subjective aspect to it. And there are some people that say that the subjective aspect is just an illusion and doesn't matter that much. But then, I mean, we have also different components like representations, metacognition, knowing about knowing, basically, right? And then self-consciousness, and I mean, each of those things could serve a different function, I guess, but at the same time, it's still not clear what the exact function is, because even when we think about our own psychology, what people have been uncovering over time is that most of what happens in our minds occurs at the subconscious level, and even when we talk about our own motivations and the reasons behind our own behavior, we are not really that good at identifying them. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's really hard to understand even, I mean, what is the proper role that consciousness plays and why it evolved at all. Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I really like these new evolutionary approaches to trying to investigate consciousness. Eva Jablonka, Peter Godfrey Smith's work, in trying to figure out what would have driven, what sorts of things in our evolutionary history would have driven the evolution of consciousness. Things like learning, general learning, I think these sorts of asking the question this way, as opposed to what is consciousness good for right now, and it's so interesting. We engage in a lot of subconscious processing right now. I think that's not the most helpful way to investigate consciousness, because we're looking at these very highly evolved conscious systems, us. Let's go back and look at very simple systems and ask what consciousness might have done for them. And the ability to feel pain and learn from pain experience certainly is a plausible hypothesis, I think, for the function of consciousness. Yeah, associative learning means you have to feel attracted to some things and feel aversion to others, and then you get learning off the ground. And that seems pretty basic. But then that suggests that consciousness is quite widespread among animals, and not just among animals, maybe plants, which nobody likes to talk about. Nobody likes to consider that, except people who like really wacky ideas. So I think it's the most exciting suggestion that I've come across lately is the stuff on plants. Maybe plants are also not just learners and cognitive beings, but maybe they're conscious too.
You say that, there aren't many people that like to associate consciousness with plants, only some wacky people out there. Are you referring to the panpsychists or people?
No, I'm referring to myself and basically. I think that it's a super interesting possibility, and it would upend a lot of assumptions. And so because it upends a lot of assumptions people have, I think that there's a certain aversion to accepting that maybe plants are conscious. So it's a hard sell. It also the work hadn't been very scientific up until lately. The work that's been done in the past 15 years or so is much better than the work that was done in the 70s on plant consciousness. And me, like probably every other philosopher who's ever taught philosophy of mind, has had to deal with students saying, well, what about plants? Aren't plants conscious? Which was always so frustrating and annoying because we had nothing to say. We had no science. But now we have science, and the science is challenging, and I find that really fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but if it happens that we find out that plants are conscious, consciousness is a mental process, right? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that get us into a new complication, because plants don't have a nervous system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Isn't that great?
Yeah, so if it happens that there are mental phenomena that can occur on a substrate that is not a nervous system, then what does that mean exactly?
What that means is that consciousness is multiply realizable, right? That you don't need a nervous system for consciousness, that maybe chemical signaling would be sufficient for consciousness. So I think that our theories right now have outstripped the science. Our theories of consciousness are way ahead of the science, and we need to do more science before we can say anything about these theories of, higher order thought theories of consciousness, or what parts of the brain are required for consciousness. All of these are premature in my mind, which is why I really like the kind of epistemic approaches to studying consciousness at this point. If we are studying consciousness by only looking at a very small subset of conscious beings and doing neurobiology on that very small subset of conscious beings, then of course we're going to be misled and say, oh yeah, you need a nervous system. You need a nervous system with this degree of complexity, or you need this kind of structure in the brain, because you're only looking at systems that have those structures, right? And that's going to be a mistake in methodology. We're going to miss out.
Mm-hmm. So if that's true, then does that mean that we could have a mind that derives from a different sort of biological substrate that doesn't necessarily have to be the combination of, for example, neurons and neurotransmitters and neurons organized in different ways and things like that. I mean, could it be even other kinds of molecules and other types of cells?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that we're in a position to say that a brain is necessary for a conscious experience. I think that that's not that controversial of a view. Even in activists who I've talked to suggest that as long as you've got a system that's performing in the right kind of way, it doesn't really matter what the substrate is. Yeah, that's. I wouldn't say neurons are required for consciousness. I don't think we have reason to conclude that right now.
Mm-hmm.
Premature.
Right. Okay, so let's get now then into questions surrounding ethics, because of course, since we are talking about particularly other animals' minds and also other plants' minds, I guess now, I mean, the ways by which people approach this question is that we try to compare the behavior of other animals to our own and also try to find many times neural correlates or try to do comparative anatomy on the level of the brain to try to figure out if other animals are also able to experience the same kinds of things that we do, if they also feel emotions, I mean, if they have a complex sociality in terms of their behavior, if they are somewhat conscious or not. So, I mean, what would you say are the basic set of features that a particular mind should have for us to consider its possessor, let's say, a moral patient?
Well, I think that there's some properties that are sufficient for being a moral patient, but I don't want to say that any of them are going to be necessary for being a moral patient. Certainly the two sorts of things that people have looked at are the ability to sentience, right? The ability to feel pain or pleasure, for example, then that makes you morally considerable, certainly on utilitarian grounds. That's all you need. Others will argue that maybe you don't need sentience, you don't need to be able to feel pleasure and pain, but if you have goals and interests and work towards those goals and interests, some sort of rationality, that's also sufficient for moral standing. And I think that probably, I mean, I'm happy with both of those approaches. Sentience would be sufficient, rationality would be sufficient for moral standing. I think that we have, I mean, I'm not an ethicist, right? So my views are not deeply grounded in any sort of professional thinking as an ethicist. But the ethicists have convinced me that animals have moral standing very widely across many species, not just great apes and corvids and dolphins, but rats and snakes and, you know, the maybe and the lice who live in our hair. All of them have moral standing of a sort. And then the question is, what do we do about that moral standing? Yeah. Right? Just because you have moral standing doesn't mean I'm not allowed to use anti-lice shampoo on my hair, right? Because we have interests that are conflicting with one another. So I think that the ethicists have interesting work to do once you see that moral standing extends really widely. And if we were to get to a point where we thought that plants had moral standing, I'm not ready to go there at this point myself. I think you'd have more interesting ethical dilemmas to work through. So that's part of why I think that topic is fun. I want to see what the ethicists do about, you know, that sort of work. Mm-hmm. I do want to say that this moral patienthood question seems like it's settled to me. So it's not that philosophically interesting. But what I have been really interested in is the question of animals as moral participants. Are animals themselves moral agents? Do they engage or something like a moral agent? this brings us back to the start of our conversation and the calibration method. What does it mean to be a moral agent? That's hard. I'm not an ethicist. So I've been asking this question about what does it mean to think normatively? What do you need for normative cognition? And do animals have social norms in their societies? So looking at both the cultural aspect of animal culture and whether that's sufficient for animal normativity, and evidence for the cognitive capacities that are associated with normativity. And I think that we find it, if we look for normativity in animal communities, I think we have evidence that they are also engaged in a normative practice. And I'm hoping that this is going to help us understand something about the evolution of morality if we look carefully at the kind of normativity we see in non-human animals. Things like this is my land and that's your land, and if you come on my land, I'm going to fight you and kill you, or try to force you out. And we see chimpanzees engaging in those sorts of behaviors. Or norms about how to treat infants. Like, infants can get away with a lot of things that adults can't or juveniles can't. They can steal food even from an alpha chimpanzee. But if the alpha chimpanzee starts mishandling the infant or getting irritated with the infant, females, even unrelated females, will come in to intervene and stop the alpha male, right? So these sorts of things are starting to look a lot like social norms if you understand social norms in a way that doesn't require sort of cognitive, sophisticated metacognitive capacities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. So I was just thinking, in terms of normativity and its relationship to having some sort of moral agency or not, I mean, would it have necessarily to be something cultural, that is some sort of information, of moral information that one animal would transmit to another, or a collective of animals would transmit among themselves? Or, I mean, could normativity be just something that an animal acquires through interacting with others in a sort of game theoretical way? That is, they are born, they start interacting with others, and then they start learning that if they do this, then that will happen, this good thing or that bad thing will happen, and then over time they develop this sort of moral system. And could it even be something, innate, in a sense, that is, that they are born with certain tendencies? I mean, when they are exposed to certain types of behavior from other animals, then they give this sort of response that is inbuilt in them. Because I was just trying to understand if normativity would entail that culture is a necessary factor behind it, or if it could be some other sort of thing.
Well, if you're talking about social norms, then I think culture is going to be a necessary part of the story. And that's how I've been thinking of normativity. So the game theoretic, learning on your own what the consequences are, and then engaging in some patterns of behavior that might be adaptive for the individual and happen to be adaptive for the group, and the group settles on, isn't the kind of picture that looks like it's got any normativity in it to me. Okay. What seems to be required for normativity, and this is something I'm taking from my ethicist friends, is that you've got to have some internal motivation for the behavior, right? So you've got to be able to think that the behavior is something that one ought to engage in, even if it's not beneficial for me to engage in it right now. So there might be some costs involved. Typically, these costs are identified as sanctioning violations of norms, right? Yeah. So if you violate a norm and I decide to punish you, of course I'm going to incur costs to punish you, and that means that I think it's really important that you follow this norm. It's so important that I will pay to show my displeasure. So the question is whether there's any sort of examples of that in non-human animals. Do we see non-human animals incur costs in order to conform to group practices? And I think that we do see this. There's really interesting work that's been done on immigration and primates. So a lot of different primate species, when they get to be sexually reproductive age, they move from their natal group. Chimpanzee females will move from group to group, and chimpanzees have been observed to change their behaviors, their socially learned behaviors. For example, how they process cracked nuts, from a more efficient way to a less efficient way, because the less efficient way was the way demonstrated by their new group. So that seems quite suggestive. If you're giving up a way of cracking nuts that's going to get you more resources with less effort, you're incurring a cost just to conform to your new group. This is from the Thai chimpanzees, who are observed to do this in a couple of different cases. There was also a formal study Erica Vanderwall and some colleagues engaged in with vervet monkeys. And these vervet monkeys were provisioned, they're wild, but they were provisioned with colored corn that had been tainted with something to make it taste bad. So two groups were taught that pink corn was bad to eat and blue corn was good to eat, and the other two groups were taught the opposite. And her original test was just to look at transmission from mother to infant, because then all the corn tasted fine. Mums were eating, the corn they learned was good, avoiding the corn that they had learned was bad. Babies followed what mums did, which is not that surprising or interesting, really. I mean, it's interesting, but it's not that surprising. But what was super exciting is that when the kids got to be mature and ready to immigrate, and so in vervet monkeys it's males, the pink corn eaters moved to the blue groups, and the blue corn eaters moved to the pink groups. And then what did they do? They all switched, except for one. They all switched this behavior. So you've got hoppers of corn that everyone's competing for, and then a hopper of corn that you've been eating since you were little, that you know is perfectly safe, nobody wants, and you're not, and you say, I'm not going to eat that either. That is biologically, like from a purely biological, functional description, it makes no sense to avoid this resource that nobody else is going after. You could have all of it, but no, you give it up so you can conform to the group. That's paying a cost. The one individual who didn't conform, he became the alpha of that group immediately. That I think is very interesting. Yeah. So that looks like normativity, right? This is paying a cost in order to go do things the group way. What we don't know is whether norm violators incur costs, right? That's one thing we don't know yet, and I think it's because we haven't been looking yet, and we should look for these things. Take this, be romantic and anthropomorphic, and take an anthropological perspective towards communities of animals and ask questions. Hey, do animals have social norms? If we don't ask the questions, we're never going to find the answers. And so let that bias lead us into new areas of investigation. Maybe we'll find nothing, then we'll know. But maybe we'll find something interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really fascinating, and I guess that it raises a lot of new questions, particularly that case that you described, and if it's really normativity, then if other animals can also be moral agents, because that would probably put many moral philosophers under trouble. So
it's also, that's why that's exciting. Anything that upends our assumptions I find super exciting. So playing on the edges is a really interesting place to be philosophically.
Yeah. So let me just ask you one last question. And since we are now talking about ethics, do you have any particular thoughts on veganism? I mean, on the vegan approach to moral, to animal. Usually people use the word rights, right? But I mean, other authors use the word animal interests, for example, because they associate rights with legal systems or something like that. But anyway, what do you think about people deriving this sort of ethical system, from knowing that we have this biological continuity with other animals, also in terms of our minds, and other animals are also able to experience pain and pleasure, and they have, some of them have have complex social interactions and relationships, and so they feel some also emotional pain when they lose, for example, a very important relationship to them, and they are, at least we suppose, somewhat conscious. So, I mean, what do you think about the sort of claims that usually vegans make about how we should deal with other animals that have these sort of mental features?
Yeah, these are very important questions that I think aren't just there for the ethicists, but for society at large to be grappling with. Once we see that mind exists very broadly across species, maybe consciousness, autonomy, rationality, then we're going to have lots of dilemmas about what to do, how to treat other animals, and not just how to eat, whether to eat them, how to keep them. Should we keep them in our homes as pets? Should we, one of the questions that a lot of supporters of animals have is whether or not to let animals in sanctuary reproduce. So chimpanzees in the United States are primarily going to sanctuary now because of the NIH decision and medical testing. And they're put on birth control so they don't reproduce, because the goal is not to have any more chimpanzees in captivity. Yeah. Questions arise about whether this is a violation of their autonomy to put them on birth control. Yeah. These questions get very complicated. Veganism is, of course, going to be tied into social lives, right? People who have traditions to eat meat or hunt animals, economic issues. So I think it's all going to be very complex. What I find interesting is that there seems to be a kind of natural move in a lot of public discussions about eating less meat, eating fewer animal products, and with the rise of these beyond meat burgers and beyond chicken and incredible burgers or impossible burgers, it looks like people are eating a lot less meat. And the meat industry is really worried about this. They're fighting so that the Beyond Beef burgers don't sit next to beef burgers in the freezer section of grocery stores. And at the same time, the almond milk and coconut milk and cashew milk and all the plant-based milk products, they're also getting pushback from the milk industry. So to not call it milk, you can't call it milk because it didn't come from a cow or a goat or an animal. So I think that it's interesting that these industries are concerned, which suggests that there's a transition that's going on. And this transition is probably like many other moral changes in society. It's going to be slow. It's going to be cultural and societal. And probably in a couple hundred years, humans won't be eating animal products very often. And we might be appalled that our ancestors did, or our offspring might be appalled that we did, the same way they were appalled about treatment of women, people from other cultures, blah, blah, blah. I think it's a cultural change. And that, yeah. I guess that's what I have to say about veganism. I think it's going to be the future. And there are moral saints right now who are practicing it really well, despite all the difficulties in our culture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Dr. Andrews, let's end on that note. And before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Oh, sure. You can find almost all my papers on my website, which is www.kristinandrews.org.
Okay, so I will be leaving that in the description box of the interview and other links to your work, to your books and papers and so on, so that people can go and check it out. And Dr. Andrews, it was a real pleasure again to have you on the show, and I really loved the conversation. So
Yeah, great. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Ricardo.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. There's also links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Sergio Condriano, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ancata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingberg, Drs. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart. My three producers, Isar Weber, Rosie, and Jim Frank, and my executive producer, Michal Ruzieski. Thank you for all.